Now, this is one of the few dates I'm going to ask you to remember. The year was 1453. Yeah, during my high school days, I checked a book out of the library called The Fall of Constantinople. And it showed how that Mehmed II, the Muslim ruler, with an army of 100,000 men, captured Constantinople. Now, this was part of the Muslim plan to take over Europe, folk. They first had to get Constantinople. Constantinople appealed to Europe for aid, except for the people of Genoa, who came around and gave a little bit of help. Nobody else responded. So the Ottomans got Constantinople. That was 1453. Well, fast forward 150 years, and this time the Muslims went to Vienna, city of Vienna, right here, yeah, right here. They got all the way to Vienna, but they were turned back. Europe got together and rallied, a bunch of them. They last tried in 1680, and they again got to Vienna. 1680, folks, it's only been about 340 years when the Muslims last tried to take over Europe. Then the big decline set in for the Muslim Empire. But by the way, in 1680, the Europeans rallied. An army came from Poland, another army came from several German states. Armies came from here in Bosnia, and they drove the Muslims out. And Islam has not been able to assert itself from that day until the 20th century. After that, Islam was on the run, on the defensive, being conquered. But 1453, two things happened that year. Number one, the 100 Years' War, which we'll talk about later, ended, and also Constantinople was captured. Historians used to say that 1453 was the dividing line between medieval and modern history. A lot was to happen right here. Not only did the 100 Years' War end and Constantinople fell, but within 50 years or so, Columbus had discovered America. And then within the 20 years after that, Martin Luther started his Reformation. So Europe between 1453 and 1550, during that 100-year period, Europe underwent some major transformations that actually, for the most part, were for the better. Europe began to explode out from its borders and overspread the whole globe. And a lot of it was due to that. But Europeans showed no help in helping the Byzantine Empire revive. And the Byzantine Empire has fallen to this day. Now, when World War I ended, and the Ottoman Empire had fallen, some people living here got together and said, we're going to restore the Byzantine Empire. And they might have done it, but the Islamic world asserted itself abruptly. And they formed a secular state, somewhat. And they kept the Byzantine Empire from reforming. But all attempts to reform or remake the Byzantine Empire have failed. The Byzantine Empire, when it fell, the Tsar of Russia said, I am now Tsar. The last Caesars died, but I married Caesar's daughter, so I'm Caesar. And these Caesars, or Tsars, sort of ruled Russia to 1917. And folk, if there is any Roman Empire today, it's the United States. We have a Senate like they did. We have a republic like they did. Their republic failed and ours. We once were under a king like they were. They were under 7 kings. We were under a few kings also at first, but we got rid of our king. They got rid of their kings. We have veto. The word veto comes from time. So some people said that the United States is a continuation of the old Roman Empire. We have a system of justice that is somewhat similar to Roman system of justice, innocent until proven guilty, part of Rome. But anyway, the Roman Empire, the first one died in 476, second one died in 1453. If there was another one, it died in 1917 when the last Tsar was lined up in front of a firing squad and executed. And now we have this one, if this is Rome. Again, it depends on what kind of history book you read. Sometimes maybe I read books that I possibly shouldn't. All right. Now we come to the 14th century. Black Death. When the Mongols began moving from Mongolia and spreading toward the west, and they took over this part of the world, perhaps unknown to them, but it's now believed strongly. A person, well, actually there's a little bit of written records of it, that they saw certain kinds of rats following them as they went across the vast amount of territory. And these rats, we now know, were carrying the fleas that caused the bubonic plague, or the Black Death. The Mongols, of course, were led by Genghis Khan, but anyway, the Black Death hit Europe in the year 1307. It came into Europe apparently from Constantinople and went around here and hit the city of Genoa. And then from Genoa it spread almost straight north rather fast, where it hit Norway and Sweden also, and it stopped Norway and Sweden from going to the colony in Greenland. Now, folk, your book mentions it, and I read it again just to make sure. It looks like a large factor in the Black Death was not just the fleas that were on the backs of the rats. A lot of it was due to climate change. And I mentioned this before, you know what I'm about to say. It's obvious that the climate cooled. The climate cooling meant a big starvation in Europe that lowered resistance to disease. And the lowered resistance to disease, of course, made it easier for the Black Death to spread. The Black Death carried off 1 out of every 3 persons living in Europe at the time, 1/3 of Europe's population. It might seem hard to believe, but whole towns were wiped out completely, whole villages. And when people realized that the Black Death has hit our village, they tried to move to another village where the Black Death was not. And the Black Death had some negative effects. Number one, it led to people hating old maids and Jews. And I think I've asked you before, but what do old maids tend to have around their household?
Cats.
Cats. The cats apparently protected the old maids from the Black Death by keeping the rats down. Now, what we now believe is that this certain rat that carried the Black Death was eventually driven off by another species of rat. These fleas, I mean, I took a course in parasitology. I have a minor, undergraduate minor in biology. But these fleas can sometimes will infect one rat of one species and will not live on another rat of the same genus. Different species, but notice they can be extremely particular about what hosts they live in. The same way with certain kinds of worms. Certain kinds of worms will thrive on one host and not another. But apparently, now humans and rats have so much in common that a lot of time we use rats in our experiments to experiment with what causes cancer. And these fleas that would live on the black rat, that would not even live on the brown rat, could also live on humans. Jews were hated also because, probably, maybe, I don't know if Jews like cats so much, but Jews emphasize cleanliness. And it's now believed that the Europeans have been a little bit cleaner. They could have greatly reduced the infection of the Black Plague. A little bit of cleanliness, and keeping a few cats around might have greatly reduced, but as it was, the plague took over Europe, wiped out 1/3 of the population, and made Jews accuse old maids of being witches. And many an old woman was burned at the stake for witchcraft. And many a Jew was burned inside his community again for witchcraft, or of course, one of the excuses that Europe used for hating Jews was the Jews, which they said were people who were Christ's enemies, and for crucifying Jesus. And again, in no way am I advocating this, folks. In no way. I mean, I've told you my wife is descended from a Jewish immigrant who came to Savannah in the early 1700s. In no way do I advocate any of this, but I have to mention it because this is part of European history, and a black part, you might say, a bad part. And about this time, and folk, I did not know this, just someone at Lockheed told me when I was in my 30s, but we do this when I was a kid. Ring around the rosies, ring around our pockets full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. This was a reference to Black Death. They believed that if they put posies, flowers in their pockets, it would ward off the Black Death somehow. So these young boys would put flowers in their pockets and go around and around a rose bush. And at a certain note in the song, you'd all fall down, indicating we'd die, and nobody would come around to bury us. They'd die, and simply everybody would flee, everybody would run. Even the clergy, Christians during the plagues of the Roman Empire had stayed around and helped, but even the priests would run from Black Death. Even the clergy. But it did have a lot to do to help Europe. For one, what few workers were left the nobility had to compete with workers to pay them more money, to pay them more money to get their workers. So to get the work done, the people who survived found their wages were higher. More and more serfs were able to buy their freedom. So there was some good that came out of it. Anyway, your book shows the path it went from up the Mediterranean through southern France and almost took a straight beeline up towards Scandinavia. And eventually it's known to have reached all of Europe, including the northern parts, beginning in 1307, but by 1347 it had taken over a lot of southern Europe and went on to Scandinavia somewhat later. Some areas just simply never got it, but there were few. There were just in one area there between western France, looks like, another area in what's we might call Poland today. They were largely spared. Now, the Black Death not only affected Europe, you may know that the Mongolians also went into China and they carried this plague with them. It also destroyed a lot of the Chinese population, and the disaster went as far as northern India. Apparently, the whole northern hemisphere was affected by climate change. And that's somewhat ironic because, folk, I would like for somebody to someday answer me. The hotter the climate is, the better life is. The colder the climate gets, the worse life is. Why are we so upset if the climate really is warming? Now, of course, they're now talking about record low temperatures. And this is ironic because I heard a story one time that Al Gore was driving along outside the city of Washington. He was having a hard time putting his car on the road. The road was very icy. The wind was blowing strong. The snow was blinding, and he was having a terrible time. He was on his way to a meeting to discuss global warming. This supposedly actually happened. And then they were going to have another meeting here in Oslo, Norway, to discuss global warming. They had to cancel the meeting. The snow was so bad that all the runways in Scandinavia were closed, and the airplanes couldn't get in to carry the delegates who were going to discuss the warming. The United States Senate was going to meet, and I believe the year was 2008, the year Barack Obama was sworn in. They were going to meet to discuss global warming. They had to cancel a meeting. The senators could not get to the Capitol because of snow. Again, I keep hearing stories. Oh yeah, just this past year, back in December, 11 months ago, a ship of scientists went on its way to Antarctica. They were going to measure the thinning ice in Antarctica to notice the ice was thinning, and the ship got stuck in ice. Any of you remember this story? The ship got stuck in the ice. Then they sent a rescue ship out, and it got stuck in the ice. They finally were able to get the scientists out. The scientists made it out alive. Some of you remember this story. The folk, this actually occurred 11 months ago, and it was going on during the Christmas holidays and New Year holidays last year. They finally got the ship out. But keep in mind, and they went down there in Antarctica in what is the Antarctic summer. In other words, the Antarctic hottest month of the year in Antarctica is the months of December and January, late December and early January. That's like the equivalent of our late June and early July here. So they went the hottest months of the year to measure the thinning ice, and the ship got stuck in the ice and stayed stuck for weeks. All right. Anyway, if any of you want to dispute it, I know the United Nations got the world's top size and told. Here's what they're telling us, folks. That global warming is caused by our emissions, and the two biggest offenders are the United States and China. Now, compared to China, compared to the United States, China is really a really dirty place to live as far as the air goes. The Chinese people actually, and folk, we have 10 times more cars than they do and more trucks. The problem is they don't have our pollution control devices. They don't have their industries, what we call house smoke. I worked at Lockheed, and Lockheed had to make sure its emissions. Lockheed spray painted a lot, but the spray from the paint did not reach the outside. It was part of my job to see to it that all the filters were working. They do the spray painting of the parts of the airplanes, but the spray was filtered by carbon filtration before the air from the spray paint booth reached the outside. And also Lockheed did a lot of furnacing, but the furnaces put out clean air. Again, the Chinese have fewer factories by far than we do and fewer automobiles, but guess what? They have pollution so bad that some of their pollution is even reaching the United States, 10,000 miles away. Yeah, and they're having difficulty breathing the air, which they are the world's biggest polluter right now. The United States got its industry somewhat, you might say, housebroken.
They just met about that.
What's that?
Obama just met over there.
Yeah, Obama went over there to China and met with the Chinese leader, and they signed an agreement. But here's what terrifies me about it, folk. If they tell the industrialized world we must stop polluting, we're one of the most industrialized nations there ever was, and folk, it's going to hurt us. They're after us. They're trying to weaken the United States. The point I'm making, folk. Maybe I didn't make it wrong. The whole idea is to try to weaken the United States to where the United States will not be able to interfere in some of the plans that other people have for the world. All right. It's obvious that with the Black Death there came a bunch of political upheaval, social dislocation. A lot of nobility died. But again, in those days, the nobles were not necessarily any cleaner than the common people. I mean, hey, King Louis XIV of France, one of the richest kings France ever had, once confided, said, I think I take a bath about once a year. You know, you might think, well, see, this, yes.
Yeah, I heard that.
Yeah.
It could have been worse. One of my teachers had taken Napoleon and told her one of his letters to his wife. He's like, I'll be back in a week. Go to bed.
Yeah. Well, see, I mean, now some American, I've not heard this lately, some American who visited Europe said that Europeans still do not take baths very often. And again, if any of you have been there, I mean, I've not been there many years, but they don't take a bath every day like we tend to here. But to Louis, I mean, even the nobility, and we have in the records where some of even the high-up kings and queens smelled so badly that the companions could not even stand to sleep with them. This was told, even the high-ups. So they did not necessarily practice any form of hygiene, that we would call hygiene. Sometimes some of them would take a bath maybe once a week or so, but this, again, made it easy for the louse to get on. Now, we still have a problem in our country sometimes with head lice, but we have ways to treat that. The body louse, I mean, folk, the body louse is almost non-existent in this country, at least as far as I know. It is. But the head lice, every once in a while, the plague of head lice will break out in our schools, and it did during the time I was teaching. About every year I taught, somebody would be room to have everybody would want to show them, avoid them, and avoid sitting at the same desk with them, and then I'd find out this person has head lice, and oh my, it created a real problem. I mean, I've heard, hey, it's no disgrace to get it. It's only a disgrace if you get it and keep it. There are ways these days to get rid of some of that stuff. But, oh yeah, then there's, of course, there's a disease called a 7-year itch that's still going around. Scabies is another more proper name for it. And it still goes around, and you might get it. Again, if you take a bath every day, that greatly reduces your chance, but it can spread. And go to a doctor if you think you have it, and the doctor can write out a prescription that will get rid of it. These diseases can be handled. But in those days, folk, they were somewhat at the mercy. They did not know about germs that cause disease. That was not found out about until later. All right. The peasants began revolting against their lords, and this was to continue. And folk, where this was to lead, eventually France was to get rid of its king, but also eventually it was to guarantee that the communists were able to take over Russia. But peasants began revolting throughout. And the peasant revolts at first, militarily did not succeed. Only the nobility had the armor, but eventually the peasants got handguns. The peasants got gunpowder. And as they did, the nobles began to give them more and more rights to keep them quiet. And of course, this would eventually lead to a great decline in the nobility and kings getting less and less authority, and Europe becoming more and more democratic. But that was in the long run. Peasant revolts were to run for hundreds of years in Europe and to finally end about the year 1848. But from about the 1200s to for a period of 600 years, Europe was beset by uprising after uprising of the poor people against their overlords. All right, with that, we'll quit. Everybody have a good weekend.